hosting it. Unfortunately, the lovely Amy has got another commitment, so you've got me, so you have to bear with me. She can do this beautifully, but I have to write it all down so I can remember to tell you everything. I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Vincent from Waves Research and Consulting. Andrew's a distinguished researcher who's never lost his childhood inquisitiveness to ask why. And so in market research, of course, he's found a career that satisfied his natural curiosity and has kept him occupied for about the last 25 years.
What's that stop count?
He likes nothing better than immersing himself in tricky client problems and believes that the role of research is to make a difference to our clients' businesses. And in order to make that difference, of course, it's quite important that they take on board the feedback. And Andrew is particularly obsessive about deliverables. In 2011, in conjunction with a PepsiCo client, Andrew gave a paper at the ECMAR Asia Pacific Conference about insight simplicity. And following on from that, he was invited to develop the ideas and made further presentations to both the European Pharmaceuticals Research Association and the South African Market Research Association. That's why I had to write it all down. So now, an audience a little bit closer to home, and you'll take us through how we can create better deliverables through carefully considered simplicity. Just before you start, a couple of points of order. If you don't mind, just turn the off for the viewing group. It's going to be filmed, just to let you know that you will be there, so you can catch up or replay on the website within the next week or so. But I'm sure if anybody wants a copy of the presentation, we can provide a copy. Just let us know at the end. Finally, if the fire alarm goes off, it's not a drill, and we do have to exit up the stairs and out the door, and then congregate outside Albert. And I think that's all. So over to you, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for coming along. Go at the start. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about simplicity, but I think what I really wanted to talk about was deliverables. And what I want us to do this evening is kind of reflect a bit on our deliverables, because as an industry, I think we can always get better at what we put in front of our clients. And by that I don't just mean our immediate clients if you're on the supply side, but actually the ultimate client, the person who's really paying for this and the person who's got a decision to make somewhere in the client organisation. So I want us to sort of really reflect on deliverables over the next sort of half an hour of my presentation, but also then in sort of hopefully some debate afterwards. So what I've got here is very much a personal perspective on deliverables, and I guess a bit of a framework within which to think about how we go about delivering insight to clients. What I'm not talking about is how to do presentations, okay? That's a kind of separate thing. They may or may not always be appropriate, but that's definitely a separate issue. So we're going to be talking really about how we can make our deliverables better and how we should think about what we provide at the end of what we do. A lot of researchers get very geeky about methodology, get very geeky about technology, and there's a lot of people really into the technology, but at the end of the day, the client wants to get their problem solved, and that's really what this is all about. Now, when we make presentations today, it's completely commonplace, isn't it, for people to be checking their emails while we're talking, people ducking out, people taking a call, people coming in late, and of course if you're presenting in this sort of environment as well, people are being encouraged to tweet, and by the way, what's it, hashtag big B2B and VICT. So all that's going on. Of course, when you're checking your emails, actually, is it really an important email from the chief exec, or is it more likely to be a notification from eBay or Facebook? So when you present in the modern world, actually, you could kind of be forgiven for hoping that someone is actually listening. And although I'm being a bit playful, we are nowadays delivering into what I would call a distraction environment. We're not sat down often with people who are focused, who've got 2 hours set aside to concentrate on what you're talking about. Our debriefs are getting shorter. I'm sure you can relate to that, but often it can be only half an hour or it can be 40 minutes. It's not always, it's all very rarely nowadays 2 hours. The other thing that's happening is that the people we work for, ultimately, the end decision makers, have got so much more information than ever before. social media analysis, they've got Google Analytics, they've got data captured by the iPad that the sales reps take on their sales calls. They've just got so much information that sits alongside our research. So the research is only ever one piece of the jigsaw. And if you think you do a project and the client makes a decision on the back of what you're telling them, then you're probably deluded. It usually sits within a framework of many pieces of information. It's part of the process, but it's not the process all on its own. So it's a complex environment that's got a lot of distraction in it. Now, it was interestingly, 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, an economist called Herbert Simon, he first came up with the idea that attention was a resource in itself. Okay? And he articulated in 1971 that in an age where information is in highly prevalent, so if we have a wealth of information, we will have a shortage of attention. And he predicted that back in 1971, that when we get a wealth of information, we will have a poverty of attention. And I think that's probably where we're at today. I also like the term that a playwright called Richard Foreman came up with to describe people today, which is that we're all becoming pancake people. Because we're all spread increasingly wide across all our friends on Facebook and all our digital channels, but actually we're very, very thinly spread because we've still only got the same amount of attention to go around. So we might be watching 100 channels on our TV, but we're not giving any of them much attention anymore. So we are becoming pancake people. So we're living in an era of quite a lot of shallow thought. People don't spend lots of time really thinking about the implications of what you're telling them. You have to kind of spell it out, or you have to drive them through a process that really helps them get to sort of take on board exactly what you're saying. But you can't finish your debrief and leave them with a whole load of things to think about, because that stuff will just get forgotten when they dash into the next meeting. So we have this more complex world that our decision makers are working in. The consumer has more choice than ever before. Most clients now have a higher cost of failure than ever before because it takes so much money to launch things, so much investment, and it's so easy for that to all go pear-shaped and suddenly get replaced by something else very quickly. We have fragmentation of media like never before, so the options for where you place your communications are just massively different than in the past. So we have an ever more complex world, which on the one hand, of course, means that our research has an opportunity to be even more important. It's even more important that people take on board what the customer has to say, what the consumer is saying now than it ever was, because it is such a complex world. So our poor clients, though, are getting hit from both sides, because on the one hand, they're getting hit with this very complex world and this need to try and understand it and figure out what the hell I should do and how I fight off these competitors who are coming at me all the time. But at the same time, they've got even less time to actually take on board the feedback from our research that might really help them solve their problems. So they're kind of getting bashed around a bit at the moment, our clients. And so it's very, very important, even more important than ever, that the insight that clients do, that the work we do really cuts through to our end users. It has to cut through because it's such a complex world. We have to help them navigate this complex world. And really, in a complex world, what you need is simplicity. You need something that will just help you, cut through all the crap, if you like, and all the options so that you can really understand what the hell's going on and how you're going to figure out a way through it. Simplicity at the end of the day requires less effort. An example of simplicity in design terms is actually not having to use the manual. If something's well designed and it's simplicity itself, often the iPhone is held up as an example of that, and you can kind of debate that. But the point is, simple things require less effort. Now, I'm very comfortable with the term simplicity at one level, because although we want things to be relatively simple for our clients to understand, and a lot of what we do is actually quite complicated. If a client has asked you to try and figure out what it's like to have children, or what's it like if you suffer from a particular disease, or how does this business go about purchasing this product, it isn't always a simple issue. Often it is quite a complex issue. So I prefer to use this term simplexity, which is about a balance between simplicity and complexity. simple deliverable and a complex deliverable. Okay. On the one hand, we don't want to dump a load of data on a client, but we also don't want to give them too simplistic a solution, because often a simplistic solution is usually wrong. Often, that's what happens. So we have to balance these two demands. And we also have to think, how accurately should we represent what we find out? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, on the one hand, we could share everything that we found out from the people we've spoken to, or the research we've done, the observations we've made. And in which case, that would be kind of the most accurate, because we are sharing everything that we found out. Or, we can only share some of what we find out. Now, if we only share some of what we find out, then actually, that's slightly less accurate. But slightly less accurate is okay. But I think this is something that we need to think about, and often we're uncomfortable not sharing everything we find out, and that leads us to make our debriefs too long and put too much in them. And I've observed from all my time in research that actually we're less comfortable thinking about accurate or inaccurate feedback than we are about accuracy in other areas. We're all very comfortable knowing that if we only speak to 300 respondents, it is not as accurate as speaking to 1,000. So we manage inaccuracy with the client on that dimension all the time. 8 groups are better than 4 groups. Similarly with analysis, a 6-cluster solution is actually less accurate than a 10-cluster solution. And again, we manage that inaccuracy with our client. There's a trade-off going on that says, well, actually, a 6-cluster solution is much easier for me to work with, so I will live with it being less accurate, because the very accurate 10-cluster solution is way too difficult to try and communicate to our business. But when it comes to feedback, I question how good we are at dealing with less accurate feedback. What happens is we have this desire to accurately reflect everything that we found out. We put too much in, and we overcomplicate sometimes our feedback messages if we're not careful. So what I feel we have to do is we have to strike the right balance on these sort of 2 dimensions. On the one hand, do we deliver something that's quite simple, or do we deliver something that's quite complex? And on the vertical, do we share everything that we found out, or do we only share some of what we found out? And what we have to do is somehow strike the right balance on these dimensions. Now, if we get this wrong, we end up in one of these 4 quadrants. Okay? In the top right, we try and share everything that we found out. We deliver quite a complex deliverable, and we just drown our clients in too much data. Although the answer is actually in there somewhere, but there's too much information. But having said that, a lot of what we do, it's not always possible to share all that we found out and do it in a simple way. So then we often fall into this trap of oversimplifying the solution to the client. In the bottom half of this, if we get it wrong, we end up in a quadrant that either just simply oversimplifies the problem, boils it down into something that's too simplistic, or we deliver too much data but actually can't make any sense of it at all. So we have to get the right balance. And if we think about this in another way, the top right is the classic situation that researchers are often criticised for, and we've all been there. We get into too long a debrief because we try to feed back too much information. We try to say everything that we found out, we perhaps make it too complex. As I say, on the left-hand side, and it's rarely achievable, but we can end up with a situation where we try and present everything, but we do it in a simple way, and it's very, very difficult to do that with the problems that we've got. But on the lower half, if we try and show only some of what we find out, if we get it wrong, then we're either just unhelpful or we've just oversimplified the whole thing. And if that's a lot of words, perhaps a better way to look at this is to think of it in these terms. So, top left is an example of less is more. Okay? You can produce something quite clean and quite simple, and actually, some of the time, that will be fine. Okay? Top right, we deliver something that is too complex. You can actually use that to tell the time, but my God, what on earth's going on? So you've just lost the core message. And then bottom left, in an effort to sort of go down the route of less is more, you You can keep going, less is more, but if you go too far down that route, you will hit a point where less becomes less. And you simplify something to the point that it becomes pretty useless to the client. And then on the right hand side, we can try and abbreviate, but it just becomes too confusing and too unhelpful. So I feel when we deliver to our clients, and this could be a report, it could be a workshop, it could be a presentation, it could be anything, we have to decide how much precision do we want. Okay? More can be less, but not always. So you could have turned up on time for tonight with both these devices, but you can probably only boil an egg accurately with one of them. So for any project and any problem that a client has, we have to decide how precise do we need to be. And if we can hit this sort of optimum point on these dimensions, we hit this point of optimum simplicity, which is what I like to call simplexity. And it's the point at which Einstein famously said that everything should be kept as simple as possible, but no simpler. So you need to try and make things simple, but only to the point that it retains its meaning. You can make things too simple and then it becomes completely pointless or useless. So we're constantly trying to balance, do we make it simpler, can I simplify this, or should I make it more complicated? We've got to constantly iterate between those two perspectives really, to try and find the most crystallised, perfect, clear piece of communication that really does justice to the work we do. There's a lot of great research that doesn't have the impact it should because we don't quite deliver it in the best way for that client to get to grips with it. So the goal is simplexity. Now, simplexity is something that you have to set out to find, okay? You will very rarely, if you're not trying to achieve it, stumble across a beautifully succinct piece of deliverable, okay? You have to kind of think about it and you have to go through, I believe, these 3 steps. And I want to talk more about these 3 steps. But the steps themselves are straightforward. It's always nice to have a 1, 2, 3, isn't it? Classic marketing speak, keep it simple. But the 3 steps that I think you have to think about is, one, you have to start with the audience, not the data. And that, to me, is perhaps the most important thing I feel I'm going to say this evening. It's always start with the audience, not the data. And I'll talk more about these. Secondly, we have to think about editing and brevity. How can we make what we've got shorter, simpler, more succinct, crisper? Can we articulate it with fewer words, with larger fonts, or not? And then we also have to think about rethinking. Sometimes in order to make things simpler, we have to redefine them and change how we say what we're saying. So if we start with the first one, we have to start with the audience, not the data. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have to start with the decision that is going to be made. So don't start from a perspective of, we've done 20 depth interviews, what did everybody say? Start from the perspective of, client has to decide, do I do this, do I do this? If I go down this route, what are the implications? What's my media plan if I go down that route? Start from the perspective of the decision that has to be made, and then look at your evidence. Then look at what you have that will support that decision. And then you frame your findings within the context of the decision. And you craft the story around the decision that has to be made, rather than around what you found out. Because we all find out lots of interesting things. Many of those things don't help the decision that is actually particularly the one on the table. It might help something else, but it may not help that decision that's on the table. So stick with the decision that's on the table. And this means we have to really understand our audiences. And this isn't just about understanding the brief, it's about really nailing the organisation, the culture, understanding how they make decisions in that organisation. And this is where I do get a bit obsessive about deliverables, because I think you really have to understand your clients. I always say to people that if I'm doing training courses in this area, that the real question is, do you understand how your client gets promoted? And do you understand how your client's boss gets promoted? And if you start to understand those sorts of things, then you start to understand how you frame the research in a way that is helpful and useful to people. But we have to understand our audiences, and as we've been saying, those audiences are becoming more distracted, they have less time than they used to have. They're also thinking a lot less deeply, and there's quite a lot of interesting research out there about this issue that people are thinking less deeply. There was a guy called Nicholas Carr, and he wrote an article in Atlantic magazine a few years ago called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And he was talking about the fact that nobody, and he's talking about consumers, he's talking about business, just don't think too much. They just Google everything. And of course, in business, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision. It's your decision. You know, do I do this? Do I do that? Do I price it at this point? Do I launch it this way? Which country do I launch in first? How do I go about doing this? How do I keep my people on board? It all requires thinking, and there's not enough thinking skills going on. Nicholas Carr, he developed that idea into a whole book all about the shallows, which is what the internet's doing to our brains. And some of you may also have heard about Susan Greenfield, the Oxford neuroscientist, who's also talking about our minds are changing and talking about the elasticity elements in our brain, that human brain is changing in line with how we are all have access to so much. This whole idea of being shallow, being spread very thin. So all of this is about understanding the audience, and really fundamentally, the first kind of key trait you need to really nail that deliverable is empathy. You have to understand what's it like for the person who's making this decision. If someone is deciding, do I launch this product or not, what are all the pressures on them? Where does the research fit in? How can you help with them and that decision? What's the culture like within their organisation? All those sorts of things. So the key skill we need is empathy. The second step is brevity. Okay? We have to get our message across in less time, fewer words, more succinctly, crisper. And Edward de Bono uses this phrase, shedding and slimming and cutting and trimming. And that's what we all need to be doing. You know, I get a bit obsessive, and I'm probably too obsessive, but I start, you know, do I need that word? Do I need 6 bullet points, or can it be 4 bullet points? Is this bullet point really 2 bullet points? You know, I'm completely obsessive about that, and I get there, and then it goes into, and what, does this font need to be bigger? Should it be smaller? You know, how am I going to get this across? Should I underline a key phrase on this chart to make sure somebody really gets it in the audience? So, you know, we need to think about brevity, and of course, the key thing here then, this is about language skills. You know, this is about not using 5 words if 2 will do. This is about editing, and you might think this is unimportant stuff. Actually, little things like whether you do a bullet with a sub-bullet or just a main bullet actually is really, really important. And if you're interested and obsessive about this stuff, then I would urge you to look at the very first, some of you may know this, but the very first space shuttle that crashed, those of us sort of my age might even remember it when it happened, the first one that kind of blew up when everyone was killed who was on board. In the inquiry that followed that, they concluded that one of the contributing factors was the use of PowerPoint. And what they concluded was that the key information that would have stopped the flight taking off was like the 5th sub-bullet on like page 12. And people didn't see it, and it didn't kind of stick in people's brains enough, and so the engineers signed the flight off, when actually, if someone had kind of not dialed it up in a bigger font, a bit more prominent, and they hadn't done it by conference call, but they had done it face to face, the inquiry concluded they don't think it would have ever taken off. So it does make a difference whether you indent it, whether you take the line spacing down so that actually it's very close to the line above, or whether it sits further apart. And I know we all have these, you know, corporate templates, but sometimes you have to think about what's the message I'm trying to get across. The corporate template might say, right, by indenting it, it makes it only a 10-point, not a 12-point font, but that might not be the right thing to do. So be obsessive about it, and I encourage you to do that. And then the third point is rethink the message. Sometimes if you want to make something, you want to make it not just shorter but simpler. And sometimes if you might end up with 80 PowerPoint charts, and you might know you've got to get it down to 40, but the way to get from 80 to 40 is not just to take out the 40 that seem less important. Usually the only way to effectively get from 80 to 40 is to actually rethink what you're saying. You can't just take a long document and take out the bits you don't like. You know, if you think about a novel, you know, if someone says, well, can you summarise a novel for me? You don't just cross out 100 pages to leave you 10 pages. You actually kind of rethink the whole thing. You say, well, what this novel is about is, and it's almost like that's what you have to do. So you need to think about how you can rethink that message in order to create stronger cut through and get it across more easily. And really you're having to balance here, you know, how simple can you make it versus actually how complex does it have to be? Because I don't believe you should just simply make things simple. You know, often what we do is not simple, okay? If you're trying to explain what's going on in a consumer's head when they're stood in front of a fixture, it's not often simple. And there are often lots of factors. But you know, often our debriefs take longer than Hollywood films, you know. And I think sometimes we just think, does it really need to take that long? You know, you watch the news. You know, people get across quite complex issues on the news in 3 minutes, 4 minutes, don't they? Now, of course, they're very highly skilled at what they do, and they've got fantastic graphics and visuals. But at the end of the day, they'll try and explain somebody's immigration policy in 2 minutes or something. You know, and we then spend 2 hours telling a client whether they should do packaging A or packaging B. And I do think sometimes, and I'm being a bit playful, but I think you kind of get what I'm saying. Now, the key thing here is that this is more of an intellectual task, because this is about reframing and rethinking it. So you might have a perfectly great story, but you just need to completely rethink it and look at it from another perspective in order to make it crisper and shorter. So really the 3 key skills that we have in order to get our deliverables to be better are empathy with the audience, you know, editing and rethinking. So I would say that Simplexity is a creative process. I think sometimes people think research is, you know, it's all about analysis, it's all about stats, and it's all a bit dry. I would completely disagree, and I think research is actually a very creative process. I think getting to a kind of point of simplicity with a deliverable is a creative process. And really, you've got to ask yourself these questions. You know, if I reduce this further, do I reduce the meaning? Do I make it harder to understand and less accurate and less meaningful? And similarly, if I add something, do I gain anything from adding it? Do I just get an extra chart in here, or am I actually adding something that really matters? And you've got to constantly kind of iterate between those 2 perspectives to try and find the point at which you think you've got your optimum deliverable. Now, just to sort of walk you through how we've used it, I just wanted to take you through a case study of how we sort of, you know, applied this kind of process and where it came out for a project we did for a client. And this was some work we did among people who had type 2 diabetes, an area where there's a lot of research work happening. A very crowded market, becoming a lot of attention on it, a lot of communication about it. And really the challenge we were set was, can we try and understand the person with diabetes from a different perspective? Can we find some new territory where we can look at this and think about communications from a new angle? Now, of course, you know, some of you, I'm sure, will have worked in this area, and we already knew going in that patients, you know, don't take diabetes seriously enough, that there's a lot of poor lifestyle choice continues, or dietary choice continues even after diagnosis, compliance is variable. We did a course study with GPs, nurses and patients in both France and Germany, and to be honest, you know, it was a very typical market research experience. We started building a debrief to reflect all that we learned, who, what, where, when, how, why, you know, all the main findings, pulling out conclusions. We were, you know, very accurately reflecting what they told us about what it was like to have the condition, what diagnosis was like, how the consultations went, what were the emotions, all the interaction between healthcare professionals and the patients, you know, how the life cycle of the diagnosis and how diagnosis changes when you're on a follow-up appointment versus initial diagnosis, you know, and so on and so on and so on. And actually, when you looked at it, if you took a kind of a critical eye to it, you hang on a minute, actually, what of all of this would the client have expected to actually see? You know, what of all of this wouldn't you find out if you just, you know, read up about it on the internet or read articles in newspapers? And actually, much of what we came up with, whilst it was interesting, was kind of old news. And actually, there were just only a couple of occasionally there would be something that was a bit more of a nugget, a bit more of a kind of snippet of something more newsworthy, but a lot of the time it was just old news. So we kind of said, right, hang on a minute, stop. We don't want to just present back a load of stuff where the client goes, you know, I suspected that would have been the case, or I thought that might have happened, or, you know, I'm perhaps not surprised. So we did a kind of a rewind and said, well, hang on a second, let's just go back. You know, what's the end user's problem? Fundamentally, it's about something unique. They want to know what's new, unique. They don't need to hear all the detail. They're interested in the new news. Okay, that's what we wanted to focus on. So let's just look at, you know, for this client, what's breaking. And really, we found that there were a couple of key elements that we had to focus on in terms of new news. And that was that for some people, diagnosis was actually a relief. So they felt better having been diagnosed than they did beforehand, which is kind of counterintuitive. And also, we found that for some people, diagnosis actually reduces the likelihood of doing anything about it. And again, counterintuitive. And so so we focused much more on those points. We decided to less accurately reflect everything that we learned. We don't need to say all about what happened and how you're feeling, and let's focus on the new news as we think it. And what we came to was that we have this, there is a counterintuitive behaviour segment within type 2 diabetes of people for whom, subconsciously at least, diagnosis helps them make sense of their past, and therefore they kind of react quite positively and feel better as a result of finding out that they have type 2 diabetes. And their kind of reaction is almost like, now I understand, I'm someone who gets diabetes, I get it now. That's kind of where they come from. And that's quite a difficult communication challenge to get across to people at the client end, who are largely quite rational, because it was a sort of, health/sciencey type organisation. And it was very counterintuitive. How can somebody feel better because they've actually been diagnosed with